Hey, what's going on, Guardians? TBL here, and there has been quite a lot of talk about this week's Nightfall strike. It is the strike Exodus crash, and whether or not it's a good strike, whether or not the Nightfall is fun, and let's just say there's been quite a bit of consternation about the absolute difficulty of this week's Nightfall, and of course the glitches and whatnot going on with the prestige version of this week's Nightfall. And I just wanted to make a quick video kind of going over the strike itself, talking about its makeup, its different sections, what I think they got right with this strike, and overall what I dislike about this strike, because there are quite a few things. And we'll speak a bit about how this relates to this week's Nightfall. And to give you a sneak peek, I actually think most of the strike is structurally fine, and that it's really just the final boss fight, that final encounter where things go off the deep end. Overall in Destiny 2, Exodus Crash is my least favorite strike in the game. It's the one that I have the least amount of fun with. Essentially, I consider it to be the wretched eye strike of Destiny 2. But let's go ahead and get into it. The first section will have you picking up arc pulses from across the map. It's pretty simple, and it's very similar to some of the charge pulse patrol missions from Destiny 1, where you hopped in your Sparrow and you had to go from pulse to pulse, building up a charge. It's like that, but with more enemies around you. It's very simple, it's a very easy start to the strike, but of course on the Nightfall, the enemies out there are a lot tougher. Especially with this week's Nightfall, with some of the Pike Dregs and the Vandals, it feels like they just have like an inherent arc burn turned on with how quickly they wipe you. But overall, this section is pretty easy to complete if you just move slowly as a team and team shot things down, which is really what you're supposed to be doing in the Nightfall. Now, the Nightfall's modifiers this week can definitely make this a little bit difficult. With attrition, you've basically got exposure on, so that you're not going to be restoring health or your shields unless you kill enemies and pick up a specific item that they drop. And of course, with Time Warp Anomalies, it's going to spawn these blue oracles across the map that you destroy. It gives you an extra 30 seconds on the clock so that you don't run out that Nightfall timer too quickly. Thankfully, these oracles, they're fairly easy to spot. So as long as you're keeping an eye out while you're moving forward, it shouldn't be too hard to find them all and get yourself some extra time on the clock. The section after that is a classic Destiny protect the ghost while he does a thing session. You'll need to clear a few waves of enemies, including Majors and what's called the overcharged Shanks. These are basically exploder Shanks that have an electric charge around them. They'll try to make their way to the ghost and they'll electrically charge the floor, which prevents you from sprinting or jumping. It's super frustrating, but in this encounter it's kind of easy to get around since the platform itself is very small. You can just kind of back off of it, but keep that in mind because it becomes a major headache later in this strike. But overall, this is a pretty standard section where you just sit back. It's a wave defense thing. You just kill things, blow up all the majors, and then you're done. Now, of course, the Nightfall version of this is very difficult because a lot of the enemies are super strong. They're super duper tanky, especially the overcharged Shanks. I feel like those things have a little bit too much health in the Nightfall. It takes like 4 or 5 shots with a scout rifle to take them down, which might not seem bad to you right now, but when you get into some of the craziness that happens later in this strike, you'll understand why you want to be able to take those things out as quickly as possible. You might just have to rely on heavy weapons to take down the overcharged Shanks, because if you don't, they will make your life absolutely miserable. And again, when it comes to the Nightfall version of this strike, it feels like there's like inherent arc burn turned on, because these things will kill you very, very quickly, regardless of what your light level is. But once the wave defense section is done, you'll have another section with arc charges, and then you'll need to destroy a fallen spider tank. After that, the final section will be a darkened room with some sneaky fallen that you'll need to just scale up before you reach the final boss arena. And that's really it. Overall, it's a fairly standard strike up into the final boss. You've got your basic, wave defense. You've got to pick up a couple of objectives out in a patrol space. There's really nothing so far about this strike that's super frustrating. I mean, the Nightfall version is rough again because the enemies are way tankier and they're dealing way more damage than, in some cases, I feel they should. But it's the Nightfall. Those enemies are supposed to be super difficult. And if you're playing the Nightfall and you've been keeping up with the anomalies, by the time you reach the final boss section, if you've been playing smart and playing safely, you should have plenty of time on the clock. Like when we were running it a couple times yesterday, we got here with as much as 14 minutes on the clock before we hit the final boss. So if I think most of the strike is fine, why is this my least favorite strike in the game? Well, it's rather simple. I think this final boss is probably one of the most frustratingly designed encounters in Destiny 2, and definitely the worst strike boss in Destiny 2. And here are my reasons for that. The boss of this strike is Thavnix the Depraved. He's a giant vandal who's really fond of stealth tech. But unfortunately, he's not very fond of sticking around, because once you deal about 5 to 10% damage to him, he has a rather sneaky habit of just disappearing and dipping out. Now, this mechanic all by itself is not bad. As a matter of fact, it's something we've seen plenty of times with Destiny bosses throughout the years. The idea of health gating a boss that he proceeds through phases is certainly nothing new, but when you mix it in with some of the other things going on in this encounter, it makes it really frustrating for this boss. So you deal a certain percentage of damage to his health, he disappears and leaves the battlefield while enemies spawn and move in. That's pretty simple, that's pretty standard. After you've killed some enemies or after some time has passed, he'll respawn somewhere on the battlefield, usually right behind you, and then get back into the fight. Now, overall, I feel like Bungie was going for something similar to the a la cool Darkblade strike, where you have a boss who takes a set amount of damage, staggers, disappears, and then is back in the fight in like 10 seconds. That's not the case with Thavix. A lot of the time, especially in the Nightfall, he seemed to disappear for an inconsistent amount of time. And of course, during that time, you just have to sit back and kill ads until he comes back. This is fine on a normal strike, but when you're on a timed strike, it doesn't really work so well when your boss takes a set amount of damage, leaves, and then comes back in 10 to 20 seconds at some points. That's a lot of time to lose for something that's not really your fault. And just the sheer amount of times it happens over the course of the fight is really kind of ridiculous. During one of the times I was doing this strike, I counted at least 10 times when he disappeared and took some time before he came back. And that's a lot of time lost when you're running this thing. And it kind of brings it to the point where you almost feel like there's a missing mechanic there. Like, I think it's one of the reasons why people were so excited when they found out about the cheese of finding him crawling on the walls and then shooting him off, because it feels like, oh, that's what you're supposed to do. When he goes invisible, maybe he jumps on the walls and you can damage him there to make him come back to the battlefield sooner. But no, it turns out that might actually just be a glitch, and this is the way the fight is supposed to be done. And you know, that kind of sucks, because that would have been nice. It would have been great if that's the mechanic. When he disappears, you just have to find wherever he's hanging out on the walls or something, pop him a couple times there, maybe it stuns him for a bit so you can deal some damage to him, and then he jumps back into the fight. But no, you just kind of have to wait for him to decide he wants to come back. And in a timed encounter, it just makes for a frustrating overall experience. Now, it's not just the mechanics with Thavix himself that I feel are the problem with this encounter. Of course, we also have those overcharged shanks who spawn all across the battlefield. They move to each of the platforms, and then if they're sitting on it, they overcharge that platform, and if you're standing on it, you can't sprint, you can't jump. It completely inhibits your movement. Now, on a normal strike, again, these just take 2, maybe 3 shots to drop, but on the Nightfall, they are surprisingly tanky. It takes forever to drop them. And on this week's Nightfall, when you've got attrition up so nobody's healing, if you get caught away from your team or maybe away from some ads and an overcharged shank pops up on your platform, it can make for an absolute nightmare experience of you not being able to sprint away, taking constant damage from standing on the floor, and just not being able to heal. Hopefully you guys are Warlocks running your Rifts or Devour builds for this. And while it's, in my opinion, not fun, but at least tolerable on a normal strike, in the Nightfall, when you move all of these elements together, it creates a really, really frustrating experience. I mean, you've got a boss whose set mechanics waste your time, you're dealing with tons and tons of ads in between damage phases, there's specific ads that spawn seemingly indefinitely across the battlefield and completely inhibit your ability to move around, you can't heal unless you kill enemies and pick up a drop from them, and you're rapidly running out of time to complete this strike. When you mix all of that together, it just creates a really not enjoyable or fun Nightfall experience, and it's why I think so many people are skipping it this week. A lot of people are talking about the timer on the Nightfall, that they don't like it, it's artificial difficulty, and that it's the real problem with this strike, and I don't think that's the case. I don't really have too much of a problem with the Nightfall timer. It can be frustrating, but it really kind of exemplifies the issues with an encounter, and that's certainly the case for this strike. I know a lot of you Guardians out there really dislike the Nightfall timer, and I agree, it is an artificial way to bump up the difficulty of a strike, but I don't think it's the overall root of the problem, at least with Exodus Crash. I think the overall problems with this strike, or really just this encounter, are with the boss mechanics themselves. I really feel like there should be some way to cause Thavix to come back sooner. Or not have him leave at all, just have him warp to some other part of the battlefield while invisible. After all, I get the feeling that the design purpose of this strike was to have you moving around constantly. I really feel like that's what Bungie wanted. They wanted you to be moving from platform to platform rather than sitting in a single spot, and that's why they utilized the overcharged shanks to try to, keep you off of specific zones. I also feel like the overcharged shanks, the boxes that spawn them, I really wish you could destroy them to kind of prevent extra shanks from spawning, because they provide a lot of frustration in this strike too. Like maybe after the second or third wave of ads, they could have had those spawn points be destroyable so that you could stop any more overcharged shanks from coming in. I don't know, clearly I'm not a game designer, I'm just talking about some things that I feel would make this specific encounter a bit less frustrating for players. But anyways, Guardians, that's pretty much it for my rant. Again, thanks for listening. I just wanted to take some time to talk about the Exodus Crash strike in and of itself. Most of the strike is fine. It's just that final boss encounter I feel has some really fundamental issues, specifically with Thavix himself being health gated and then being on a timer before he comes back, and there being no way to just kind of force him back or damage him while he's off running from you. I just think it already makes for an unfun strike boss. When you add on Nightfall modifiers, it really makes it apparent. Who knows, maybe actually having Prism on would have made this a lot easier to deal with. But alright Guardians, that's it for this one. Thanks so much for watching. Be sure to let me know what you Guardians think of the Exodus Crash Strike in this week's Nightfall and Prestige Nightfall down in the comment section below. Did you guys beat the Nightfall or the Prestige? If you beat the Prestige, give yourself a round of applause. That feels like it's nearly impossible right now. But anyways, I'm out for now. Thanks so much for watching. As always, I am the Black Link. You Guardians, stay frosty.